Months before the general election in Great Britain, Prime Minister Sunak is handing out the first, let's say, election gifts. But will cuts in social security, for example, be enough to catch up in the polls and calm his party? Danger increases courage, wrote Shakespeare. And months before the general election, the poet's quote seems to fit the British Prime Minister perfectly here. These are dangerous times for Rishi Sunak, was said by political analyst Mark Garnett, because the problems of the Conservative head of government are immense. Up to 30 points behind in the polls, a defeat in court, and an increasingly clear crack in his Conservative party. And in what was probably his last attempt to turn things around, Sunak had his finance minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer Jeremy Hunt, announce the first tax cuts in years. For many commentators, this seems like the courage of desperation. Let's be honest, tax cuts are about the least Sunak can do to win over a demoralized party and angry voters, commented Politico, for example. And Garnett also emphasized that lower taxes were the only remaining glue for the Tory party. According to experts, the fact that, among other things, the social security contribution rate is now to be reduced is, above all, an early election gift worth billions. Just a few weeks ago, Finance Minister Hunt had ruled out tax cuts, and now he promises a lot of support for the economy, and the industry association CBI has praised him for this. But retailers reacted with disappointment, and the opposition Labour Party emphasized that the tax burden for consumers was still higher than in the previous election in 2019. For the right wing of the Tories, the step did not go far enough even. Ultimately, only a portion of what the government previously took away will be returned, wrote Conservative economist Julian Jessup. The exact date of the parliamentary election has not yet been set, but it is expected to take place in 2024. And in all polls, Sunak's Tories are almost hopelessly behind Labour's Social Democrats. A historic debacle is looming, and the autumn budget for growth, which his Chancellor of the Exchequer announced in Parliament in London, is likely to be Sunak's last bullet, so to speak. And recently there have been several failed restarts. Scarlett Maguire from the polling company Jail Partners told the Telegraph newspaper. And Sunak's self-promotion at the Tory party meeting as a candidate of change was one of them. After 30 years of Conservative government, it was quickly exposed as untrustworthy, and his legislative proposals from the pompous King's Speech barely offered any new impetus. And the cabinet reshuffle with the surprise return of former Prime Minister David Cameron as Foreign Secretary, well, provoked rather astonished questions as to whether Sunak did not trust any Tory MP to hold the important post. The Conservatives lack a clear sense of the direction in which they want to steer and what they want to stand for. Sunak's zigzag course is not helping here, and at the first he seemed to be getting closer and closer to the ultra-conservative Home Secretary Suella Braverman. And when Braverman went too far in her criticism and Sunak had to throw her out, he opted for much more moderate politicians with the returnee Cameron and former Foreign Secretary James Cleverly as the new Home Secretary. Criticism of the head of government has been growing within the Conservative Party for weeks now. The cracks in the party, they are enormous, and the fired Home Secretary Braverman took aim at Sunak in an incendiary letter, and parts of the right wing are barely concealing their agitation against the Prime Minister. But there's also a risk of revolt from the moderates if Sunak actually abandons international human rights agreements in order to implement his controversial migration policy. Many Tories are frustrated and fear for their seats. The whole party has the impression of little children when they are well past their bedtime, very tired and grumpy, as one lawmaker told Politico. And expert Garnett from Lancaster University emphasized in an interview with the German press agency, under these circumstances, Sunak's best protection against internal critics is that they cannot afford to change their leader a third time within a legislative period. Observers scoff that the only thing that could help is one of the measures announced by Finance Minister Hunt. that the alcohol tax will remain frozen until August and not increase again. After all, the situation can only be a good place to drink, so to speak. After weeks of leaks, Jeremy Hunt's autumn statement held just few surprises. Nor is it particularly shocking that the Chancellor will attempt to keep Brexit impacts on the UK economy out of the debate in the days to come, so no mentioning. No amount of personal or business tax cuts will undo the damage that Brexit has done and continues to do so to their economy, said the European Movement UK after Hunt's speech. The true extent of the economic damage of Brexit will take 15 years to fully materialize. The National Institute of Economic and Social Research predicts that by 2035 the economy will be between 5 to 6% smaller than it would be if they had not left the European Union. And this means that if it were not for Brexit, the economy would be much stronger than the economic picture presented by the Chancellor in the autumn statement. And according to the group, Brexit is already costing each person in the UK about £850 a year, and the situation is only going to worsen. The cost is set to reach £2,300 per person per year over the next decade. And in a report released last week, the National Institute of Economic and Social Research estimates that this will increase to 5 to 6% of GDP a year by 2035. Britain cannot afford Brexit. Budget tinkering cannot hide that elephant in the room. That was said by Cynical, the CEO of European Movement UK. And if Jeremy Hunt wants to set the UK back on a path to growth and put more money in British pockets, he should announce a clear medium-term plan to get the UK back in the single market and invite other parties to sign up to it. That plan would take time to deliver, but it would start to restore investor confidence overnight, they say. Last week, the European Movement UK published its Business Impact Report detailing the post-Brexit experiences of over 1,700 businesses. Just over 93% of businesses surveyed said that Brexit has affected them negatively, while 95.5% said they would benefit from regaining access to the EU single market. And according to the EM UK, if the UK was still a member of the European Union, the autumn statement could have addressed the cost of living crisis, the impact of COVID on the economy, and the inflation crisis. Instead, there was a Brexit-shaped elephant in the room. The government set out plans to freeze alcohol duty on Wednesday until next August, as I said, as the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, laid out a raft of policies in his autumn statement. Hunt confirmed the Brexit pubs guarantee, which means that duty on a pint is always lower than in the shops. The freeze means that there will be no increase in the price of beer, cider, wine or spirits until summer next year. And alongside this policy, the Chancellor increased tax on hand-rolling tobacco by 10%. The news comes after trade bodies observed falling sales for drinks in the UK. The Wine and Spirit Trade Association found spirit sales have dropped by a fifth, so approximately 20%, over the last month as people's finances tighten and there is still high inflation. And wine has also seen a double-digit decline during the same period. The decline followed an alcohol duty hike introduced at the beginning of August this year, which represented the steepest rise in almost 50 years. And the shift meant that alcohol is now taxed by percentages, so to speak. As inflation has eased, the price of wine and spirits have seen significant hikes in the last 3 months. According to data from the Office of National Statistics, the ONS, the average price of a bottle of vodka in September this year was £16.80. That's 14% more than in the same month in 22. An average bottle of gin was priced at £17.01, a 10% increase. And whether the promised tax cuts or the farce surrounding the refugee plans, the Tory government's policies only serve to keep the right wing of the party quiet and to harm the opposition. When Rishi Sunak moved into Downing Street as British Prime Minister just over a year ago, he promised a new start. And after the unprecedented farce of the Johnson years, a politics of reason was supposed to return to Westminster. And a year later, nothing of this has happened. One scandal follows the next, and the dismissal of his Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, who is on the far right, has not brought calm in the party. On the contrary, by appointing David Cameron, who is considered to be more moderate, as Foreign Secretary, Sunak has only provoked the right wing of his party even more. And this means that any coherent policy that could put the country, which has been hit economically since Brexit, back on a more solid footing, and the whole thing is falling by the wayside. The budget announced with great euphoria is just the latest example of this. Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, announced a host of tax cuts, but the counter-financing of these will only take place in the future through severe cuts in social benefits and public facilities. It is a less than elegant cuckoo's egg laid for the opposition Labour Party, which is currently a good 20 to 30 percentage points ahead of Sunak's Conservative Tories in the polls. With this tax cut package, Labour leader Keir Starmer is likely to inherit a public budget in 2024, if he wins the election, that could hardly be more burned out. The only potential way out would be for him to announce during the election campaign that he would raise taxes again, which Starmer can hardly do if he wants to win the elections. And this means that the new budget is nothing more than a cynical device by the Tories to help Labour boss make his life even more difficult if he wins the election. And to actually solve even a single one of the Great Britain's current problems will be made impossible, such as the urgently needed overhaul of the rundown health system. What the British have been experiencing with the ruling Tories since the time under former Prime Minister Boris Johnson is the sad spectacle of a formerly Conservative party whose flirtation with right-wing populism has led to it no longer governing. That means trying to solve problems for the good of the country. Instead, they only perform political pirouettes to stay in power. And Rishi Sunak's messy refugee policy is another example of this type of purely performative politics. From the outset, the idea of flying refugees to Rwanda in order to leave them there to the goodwill of those in power in Kigali was nothing more than a cynical attempt to portray the constitutional state as an enemy in order to distract from one's own incompetence. To develop a refugee policy would have been the better part, but because Johnson, who invented the Rwanda policy, knew full well that it would fail not only because of the British courts, but also because of all international refugee conventions. And quite apart from the fact that every single refugee flown to Rwanda in this way would cost the taxpayer around 180,000 euros, and Rwanda has repeatedly stated that it can take in a maximum of a few thousand people. But the noise about it, according to the calculations, is well suited to portraying the social democratic opposition as a failure when it comes to dealing with migrants, should they even dare to take action against it. The fact that the principle of the rule of law is being increasingly undermined in this way no longer matters to almost anyone in the Tories, not even Rishi Sunak. The British Prime Minister may be a pragmatist at heart, but he clearly cannot cope with the dynamics of the Tory party, which has gotten completely out of control since Johnson, as his recent dealings with the British Supreme Court show. After he issued a devastating rejection of the Rwanda policy last week on the grounds that Rwanda was not a safe country for refugees, the deputy parliamentary group leader of the Tories declared that the ruling should simply be ignored and the asylum seekers still be flown there. It was an open call to break the law, for which he would have been immediately fired in any normal democracy. But not in today's Britain. Instead, Sunak followed his advice and announced the next day that he would present an emergency law that would still declare Rwanda a safe country. That's a step that will simply prolong the debacle surrounding the Rwanda policy, because any self-made emergency law will, in case of doubt, fail again in the courts or even earlier in the House of Lords. The whole thing, like the budget presented, is nothing more and nothing less than a political farce, with the sole purpose of keeping the right wing in their own party quiet for a while, and at the same time keeping the debate going as long as possible, to the detriment of the Labour Party. And instead of a new start as a pragmatist, Rishi Sunak has cultivated a new variant of political shadowboxing in the tradition of Boris Johnson. And to the detriment of the country, which no longer has a pragmatic government in front of it, but rather a political theatre that constantly goes in circles and goes round and round and round. And I just want to remind everyone again, because of my background, in normal times, with a conservative party in Britain and not a right-wing populist conservative party in Britain, I usually would be completely on the side of that party. I am a member of a conservative party here in Europe, in the rest of Europe. But it is impossible to do, and that should tell my viewers much more than any words I can say. But if you want to see something else, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.